I never thought helping my neighbors would lead to a full-blown war, but that's exactly what happened. It started, as these things often do, with a little bit of power going to someone's head. In our neighborhood, that someone was Brenda, and the power was the presidency of the Cedar Creek Homeowners Association. For years, the HOA had been a sleepy, almost non-existent entity. We paid our dues, they cut the grass in the small common area by the entrance, and that was about it. It was a live-and-let-live kind of place, a quiet suburban pocket where people knew each other's names but didn't live in each other's pockets. I liked it that way. It was peaceful. My name is Mark, and I run a small landscaping and snow removal business. It's not glamorous work, but it's honest, and I take pride in it. I'd lived in Cedar Creek for over a decade, having bought my small house right after I started the company. It was the perfect base of operations, a decent-sized garage for my truck and equipment, and a community full of potential clients. Most of my neighbors were my customers, and the ones who weren't were still friends. We'd wave as I headed out in the pre-dawn hours, and they'd leave a cold drink on my porch step on a hot summer afternoon after I'd finished their lawns. It was a good life, simple and straightforward. Brenda moved in about 3 years before the trouble started. She and her husband bought the corner lot, tore down the modest rancher that was there, and built a house that was just a little too big for the property, all beige stucco and imposing columns. From the beginning, she carried herself with an air of superiority, as if she'd been reluctantly demoted to living among us common folk. She joined the HOA board within 6 months of moving in, and a year after that, through a combination of relentless campaigning and the general apathy of everyone else, she was elected president. The changes started small, almost comically so. The first new rule was about trash receptacles. They had to be stored out of sight, which was reasonable enough, but they also had to be a specific brand and color, a proprietary shade of taupe harmony, if they were to be left at the curb for more than a designated 4-hour window on collection day. Emails went out. Notices were posted. A few people grumbled, but most of us just ordered the new, overpriced cans to keep the peace. It was easier than fighting. Then came the regulations on garden decorations. No gnomes. No pink flamingos. Wind chimes were permissible only if they were made of bamboo and produced a tone no higher than a C-sharp. Holiday decorations were the next battleground. An approved list of tasteful decorations was circulated. Inflatables were strictly forbidden. Lights had to be static white, no blinking, and they had to be taken down by the 2nd of January, without exception. Failure to comply would result in a $25 fine. Each new rule was a drop of water in a bucket, and while no single drop seemed worth making a fuss over, the bucket was slowly filling. The community's quiet tolerance was being mistaken for weakness. Brenda patrolled the neighborhood in her oversized sport utility vehicle, a clipboard on the passenger seat, taking notes. She saw herself not as a neighbor helping to maintain standards, but as a warden enforcing order. Her emails, once polite requests, became stern directives, quoting bylaws and citing potential penalties. The friendly, relaxed atmosphere of Cedar Creek was slowly being choked by a thicket of petty regulations. Most of us just sighed and complied. We were busy with our own lives, our jobs, our families. Fighting over the acceptable decibel level of a wind chime felt absurd. We didn't realize that we were engaged in a battle of inches, and we were ceding ground every single day. The real conflict, the one that would change everything, was still to come. It would arrive, as many of life's biggest problems do, with the weather. The winter had been mild up to that point, but the forecasters started talking about the storm of the decade about a week out. They weren't wrong. It started on a Thursday night, fat, heavy flakes falling silently in the dark. By Friday morning, we had a foot on the ground, and it was still coming down with a vengeance. For most people, this was a snow day, a chance to work from home or just enjoy a day off. For me, it was game time. This was my bread and butter. My phone started ringing before the sun was even up. My regular clients, businesses that needed their lots cleared, and residential customers who needed to get out for work. I spent the entire day in the cab of my plow truck, a thermos of coffee beside me, battling the endless white The snow was relentless, piling up faster than I could move it. By the time I finished with my commercial contracts late in the afternoon, the storm was finally starting to let up. The sky was still a flat, bruised grey, but the snowfall had tapered to a light dusting. We had nearly 3 feet of heavy, wet snow blanketing everything. My work wasn't done. I always made it a point to take care of the elderly residents in my neighborhood. Mr. and Mrs. Allen on the next street, both in their 80s. Mrs. Gable, a widow whose health was failing. And my own mother. She still lived in the house I grew up in, just on the other side of the Cedar Creek development. She was in the final stages of her fight with cancer, and visiting nurses came every day. Getting her driveway and walkway cleared wasn't just a convenience, it was a necessity. I started with the Allens, clearing their driveway and shoveling a wide path to their front door. They waved from the window, their faces a mixture of gratitude and relief. Then I moved on to Mrs. Gable's house. By the time I got to my mother's street, it was getting dark. The streetlights cast a pale, lonely glow on the massive snow drifts. Her house was at the end of a cul-de-sac. I cleared her driveway carefully, then spent another half hour with a shovel making sure the path for the nurses was wide, flat, and safe. My back ached and my arms felt like lead, but it was a good kind of tired. It was the feeling of a hard day's work well done. Finally, I headed for my own home. My driveway was the last one I did, pushing the massive piles of snow to the edges of my property. It was nearly 9 o'clock at night. I was exhausted, covered in a mixture of sweat and melted snow, and looking forward to nothing more than a hot shower and a warm meal. As I climbed out of my truck, a figure emerged from the house across the street. It was Brenda. She was bundled in an expensive-looking parka, a clipboard clutched in her gloved hand. She marched across the street, her boots crunching purposefully in the snow. "Mark," she said, her voice sharp and devoid of any warmth. There was no "how are you" or "tough day," just my name, spoken like an accusation. "Brenda," I replied, trying to keep the weariness out of my voice. "Quite a storm." "Indeed," she said, her eyes scanning the mountain of snow I had piled at the edge of my lawn, near the curb. "I need to talk to you about this. And about your activities today." I sighed internally. This was the last thing I wanted to deal with. "What's the problem?" "The problem," she began, tapping her pen on the clipboard for emphasis, "is twofold. First, you are in violation of Bylaw 17, Section C, which clearly states that snow removed from a private driveway cannot be deposited on common property. The area between the curb and the sidewalk is common property." I looked at the pile of snow, then back at her. "Brenda, it's 3 feet of snow. Where else is it supposed to go? Everybody piles it by the curb." "Everybody is not a commercial snow removal operator," she countered, her voice dripping with condescension. Which brings me to the second problem. Bylaw 32, Section A. The operation of heavy commercial equipment for non-HOA purposes is prohibited within the community during a declared state of emergency. The county declared one this morning. Your business activities today were in direct violation. I stared at her, my exhaustion momentarily replaced by sheer disbelief. "Are you serious?" I was clearing driveways so people could get out. I cleared the Allens' driveway. I cleared Mrs. Gable's. I cleared my own mother so her nurse can get in tomorrow. It's called being a neighbor. You were operating a business, she insisted, her face a rigid mask of self-righteousness. You were paid. And you violated the bylaws. I'm issuing you a formal warning for the snow pile. You have 24 hours to have it removed. Not moved to another piece of common property, but removed entirely from the development. As for the illegal operation of your equipment, you will be receiving a notice of fine in the mail. $250. I felt a hot flash of anger rise in my chest, but I pushed it down. Arguing with a zealot was pointless. "Brenda, this is ridiculous. It's a snowstorm. People need help. The rules are the rules, Mark," she said, turning to leave. "They exist to maintain order and protect property values. You're not exempt. 24 hours on the snow pile, she marched back across the street without another word, disappearing into her oversized, perfectly cleared house. I stood there in the cold, the hum of my truck's engine the only sound. The absurdity of it all was staggering. I had just spent 14 hours helping my community, and my reward was a lecture, a warning, and a hefty fine from a woman who hadn't lifted a finger to help anyone. The bucket of petty grievances wasn't just filling up anymore. It had just been kicked over. The war had begun, and I hadn't even known I was fighting. The next morning, I woke up sore and angry. The demand to have the snow pile removed from the development was the most ludicrous thing I had ever heard. It would require a front-end loader and a dump truck, a service that would cost hundreds of dollars, assuming I could even find someone available on such short notice after a blizzard. It was an impossible, punitive demand designed to assert her authority. I decided to ignore it. The snow would melt eventually. What was she going to do, sue the sun? The official letter arrived 2 days later. It was printed on heavy cream-colored paper with the Cedar Creek HOA logo embossed at the top. Brenda's signature was at the bottom, a sharp, angular scrawl. The letter formally documented the warning for the snow pile and levied the $250 fine for operating my truck. It stated that failure to pay the fine within 30 days would result in a late fee of $50, and continued non-compliance could lead to further action, including placing a lien on my property. I tried to be reasonable. I wrote a calm, logical email to the entire HOA board, not just Brenda. I explained the nature of the storm, the necessity of clearing driveways for elderly residents, and the physical impossibility of removing a multi-ton pile of snow from the neighborhood. I pointed out that my actions were in the spirit of community, not in violation of it. I requested that they review the situation and waive the fine. The response came from Brenda's personal email address less than an hour later. It was a single sentence. The board has reviewed your case and the decision stands. The board, I knew, consisted of Brenda and 2 of her handpicked cronies, a retired couple who were terrified of her and rubber-stamped her every decision. There had been no review. My frustration began to mix with a sense of dread. This wasn't just a disagreement anymore, it was a targeted campaign. I started talking to my neighbors. The Allens were horrified. Mr. Allen, a former union negotiator, offered to speak to Brenda on my behalf. He called me back an hour later, his voice heavy with defeat. "Son, that woman is a brick wall. She told me the rules apply to everyone, and that your so-called charity work doesn't give you a free pass. She even had the nerve to suggest that my gratitude was clouding my judgment." The conflict began to affect more than just me. A week after the storm, with the snow still piled high everywhere, Mrs. Gable's visiting nurse was unable to park safely near her house. I had always kept her driveway and a spot on the street clear, but now I was hesitant. I hadn't touched my plow since the day of the storm, worried about incurring more fines. The nurse had to park 2 houses down and navigate the icy, uneven sidewalk. She slipped and fell, thankfully only bruising her hip, but it was a serious scare. Mrs. Gable's son called me that night, furious at the HOA. He'd filed a formal complaint, but he knew it would go nowhere. The community was on edge. People who had once been friendly and open were now cautious. No one wanted to be Brenda's next target. They'd offer me words of support in hushed tones when we met at the mailbox, but no one was willing to challenge her publicly. They had their own lives to worry about, their own potential violations to hide, a fence that was 6 inches too high, a brand of trash can that wasn't taupe harmony. Brenda had cultivated an atmosphere of fear, and it was working. The second letter arrived exactly 30 days after the first. It was a second notice of unpaid fine, this time for $300, including the late fee. It contained the same threatening language about liens and legal action. It was at this point I realized that reason and logic were not going to win this fight. I was dealing with a petty tyrant who was using the flimsy shield of the HOA bylaws to wage a personal vendetta. I didn't know why she had singled me out, perhaps my blue-collar business offended her sensibilities, or maybe she just couldn't stand seeing someone who was genuinely respected by the community. The reason didn't matter. What mattered was that I was being pushed into a corner. I thought about my mother. She was getting weaker, and the daily visits from her nurse were her lifeline. The idea that some bureaucratic nonsense could jeopardize her care filled me with a cold fury. This wasn't about snow piles or commercial vehicles anymore. It was about decency and respect, two things Brenda seemed to know nothing about. I decided it was time to stop playing defense. I made an appointment with a lawyer. Mr. Thompson was a man in his late 60s with a kind face and eyes that had seen it all. His office was in a small, unassuming brick building downtown, filled with law books and the faint smell of old paper. I laid out the whole story for him, from the first new rule about trash cans to the latest fine notice. I showed him the letters and the emails. He listened patiently, nodding occasionally, his hand steepled under his chin. When I was finished, he leaned back in his leather chair and let out a long sigh. "Well, Mark," he said, his voice calm and measured. "You've got yourself a classic case of what I call petty dictator syndrome. It's unfortunately common in HOAs. A person gets a little taste of power, and they become a bigger tyrant than a king." "Can she do this?" I asked. "Can she really put a lien on my house over a $250 fine for helping my neighbors?" "Technically, yes," he said, and my heart sank. The bylaws are a contract you agree to when you buy a house in the development. If the bylaws grant the board the authority to levy fines and place liens for non-payment, then they can do it. The legality of the fine itself might be questionable, but fighting it in court would cost you thousands of dollars, far more than the fine itself. She knows that. It's how they bully people into compliance. I felt a wave of despair wash over me. So, I just have to pay it? I have to let her win. Mr. Thompson held up a hand. I didn't say that. We don't have to fight her on her battlefield. We need to find a different 1 inch. He leaned forward, his expression becoming more intense. These petty dictators have a common weakness: they are often so focused on the letter of the law that they get sloppy. They believe they are untouchable. You need to scrutinize everything they do. Go over the HOA's founding documents, the covenants, conditions, and restrictions. Go over the state laws governing homeowners associations. And most importantly, get your hands on the financials. Meeting minutes, budgets, bank statements, contracts. You have a right to see them as a homeowner. What am I looking for? I asked. Anything, he said. Procedural errors. Did they follow the proper notification rules for meetings? Did they vote correctly on these new rules? Is the money going where it's supposed to be going? People like this, who crave control, often get greedy. They see the HOA treasury as their own personal piggy bank. Look for contracts given to friends or relatives. Look for unusual expenses. Find one thread, just one, and you can unravel their whole sweater. I left his office with a renewed sense of purpose. The frustration was still there, but now it was channeled. It had a direction. I was no longer just a victim of Brenda's tyranny, I was an investigator. That evening, I drafted a formal, legally worded request, citing the relevant state statutes Mr. Thompson had given me, for a complete copy of the Cedar Creek HOA's financial records for the past 2 years, along with the minutes from all board meetings. I sent it via certified mail to the HOA's official address, which was, of course, Brenda's house. The hunt was on. The third letter that arrived was the one that changed everything. It wasn't addressed to me. It was addressed to my mother. It was another cream-colored envelope with the Cedar Creek HOA logo. My hands trembled slightly as I opened it. It was a notice of potential lien. It stated that because my business was registered to my home address, and because I had an outstanding debt to the HOA, they were exploring all avenues for collection. Since my mother's property was also within the Cedar Creek development and associated with me through family ties and my documented, unpaid work on her property, they were notifying her that her home could be subject to a lien to satisfy my debt. I read it 3 times, unable to believe the words on the page. It was legally nonsensical, a desperate, vicious scare tactic. They couldn't put a lien on my mother's house for my supposed debt. But my mother didn't know that. All she would see was a threatening letter from an official-looking body, threatening to take her home. Her home. The place she was supposed to be spending her final days in peace, surrounded by memories. The place my father had built for their family. The cruelty of it was breathtaking. Brenda knew my mother was sick. The whole neighborhood knew. This wasn't just bureaucratic overreach anymore. This was a targeted act of malice, designed to inflict the maximum amount of emotional distress. She wasn't just coming after me now, she was coming after my dying mother to get to me. That was it. The line had been crossed. The anger I felt was no longer hot and impulsive. It was ice-cold, sharp, and focused. The gloves were off. My investigation, which had been a matter of principle, was now a mission of vengeance. I immediately called Mr. Thompson. His reaction was a quiet, seething fury. "This is unconscionable," he said, his voice tight. "It's legally baseless, but it's a form of elder abuse, plain and simple. It's harassment. Keep that letter. Do not show it to your mother. We will deal with this." His words solidified my resolve. Brenda had made a critical mistake. She thought she was demonstrating her power, showing me how far she would go. But what she had actually done was remove any shred of doubt I had about the righteousness of my cause. She had shown me that there was no reasoning with her, no finding a middle ground. She had to be removed, completely and utterly. A few days later, a thick manila envelope arrived in response to my certified letter. It contained the HOA's financial records. Brenda had probably delayed as long as she legally could, but she had been forced to comply. That night, I spread the documents across my kitchen table. Bank statements, profit and loss reports, invoices, meeting minutes. It was a mountain of paper. With a pot of black coffee brewing on the counter, I began to dig. For hours, I sifted through the numbers. Most of it was mundane: water bills for the common area sprinklers, insurance payments, the fee for the accountant who prepared their taxes. But then I started to notice a pattern. Every month, there was a significant payment, always for the same odd amount, $3,450, made out to a company called Prestige Property Management. I'd never heard of them. According to the invoices, they were being paid for community standards compliance and inspection services. This struck me as strange. Brenda was the one who drove around with the clipboard. She was the compliance inspector. Why were they paying an outside firm for a job she was so clearly doing herself, and with such relish? I looked back through the records. The payments to Prestige had started the month after Brenda became president. Over 2 years, the homeowners of Cedar Creek had paid this mysterious company over $80,000. My heart started to beat a little faster. This was a thread. I went to the meeting minutes. I found the meeting where the contract with Prestige was approved. The minutes, recorded by one of Brenda's cronies, were vague. President Brenda presented a proposal to engage a professional management company to assist with compliance enforcement. The board discussed the benefits of outsourcing this task to ensure impartiality and efficiency. Motion to approve the contract with Prestige Property Management was made, seconded, and passed unanimously. No mention of other bids. No discussion of the cost. Just a proposal and a unanimous vote from a 3-person board. It smelled fishy. I turned to the internet. I searched for Prestige Property Management. The company had a bare-bones website, full of stock photos and corporate jargon. There was no physical address listed, only a post office box in a neighboring town. I did a search of the state's business registry. I found the incorporation documents for Prestige Property Management, LLC. The registered agent and sole officer was listed as a man named Robert Peterson. The name didn't mean anything to me. On a hunch, I went on social media. I looked up Brenda's profile. It was mostly pictures of her oversized house and her prize-winning roses. I looked at her friends list. I scrolled through, looking for anyone with the last name Peterson. And there it was. A woman named Susan Peterson. Her profile picture showed her standing next to a man, arm in arm. The man was smiling broadly. I clicked on his profile. Robert Peterson. According to his page, he was happily married to Susan. And according to Susan's page, her maiden name was Miller. She was Brenda Miller's sister. I felt a jolt of adrenaline, the kind you get when the last piece of a puzzle clicks into place. Robert Peterson, owner of Prestige Property Management, was Brenda's brother-in-law. She had steered a no-bid, $80,000 contract to her own family, paid for with our HOA dues. The community standards compliance and inspection services was a sham. It was a ghost company set up to funnel our money directly into her family's pockets. But there was more. As I sifted through the bank statements, I started looking at the smaller charges on the HOA's debit card, the one Brenda held. There were charges for gasoline, despite the HOA owning no vehicles. There were numerous charges at expensive restaurants in the city, categorized as board meetings, even on weekends when no meetings were scheduled. There was a charge for over $400 at a high-end department store. It was embezzlement, plain and simple. It wasn't just a few dollars here and there, it added up to thousands. I sat back in my chair, the pile of documents in front of me no longer a mystery, but a damning indictment. I had it all. The fraudulent contract. The embezzlement. And I had the letter she sent to my dying mother. I had the means, the motive, and now, the opportunity. The annual homeowners meeting was in 2 weeks. It was usually a sparsely attended affair, but this year, I was going to make sure it was standing room only. My strategy shifted from defense to all-out assault. Brenda wanted a war, and I was about to bring the full weight of her own corruption down on her head. The next 2 weeks were a blur of meticulous preparation. I didn't want to just present accusations, I wanted to lay out an airtight case that would leave no room for doubt or denial. I spent hours at a copy shop, making duplicates of every incriminating document. The invoices from Prestige Property Management. The state business registration showing Robert Peterson as the owner. Screenshots from social media clearly establishing the family connection between Brenda and Robert. The bank statements, with every questionable purchase, the gas, the lavish meetings, the department store splurge, highlighted in bright yellow. And at the very top of each packet, I placed a copy of the cruel, malicious letter she had sent to my mother. The notice of potential lien. This wasn't just about financial crimes anymore. This was about her character. I wanted every resident of Cedar Creek to see not just the thief, but the bully. I compiled everything into a neat, professional-looking folder. On the cover, I printed a simple title, "To Special Report on the Financial Health and Governance of the Cedar Creek HOA." I made 100 copies, enough for every single household in the development. The night before the annual meeting, under the cover of darkness, I walked the neighborhood. Street by street, house by house, I quietly placed a folder on every doorstep. It felt like a clandestine operation, my heart pounding with a mixture of anxiety and grim satisfaction. I was about to detonate a bomb in the middle of our quiet community, and there was no telling what the fallout would be. But I knew it was necessary. The disease had to be cut out before it could kill the patient. The annual meeting was held in the small clubhouse by the community pool. In previous years, you'd be lucky to see a dozen people show up. That night, the room was packed. People were standing along the walls and spilling out into the hallway. I saw faces I hadn't seen in years. The Allens were there, sitting in the front row, their faces set with grim determination. Mrs. Gable's son was there. Nearly every homeowner in Cedar Creek was present, and every single one of them was clutching the folder I had delivered. Brenda and her 2 bored cronies sat at a folding table at the front of the room. She was beaming, clearly misinterpreting the massive turnout as a sign of her successful leadership and community engagement. She looked out at the sea of faces, completely oblivious to the storm that was about to break over her head. "Welcome, everyone," she began, her voice radiating false warmth. "It's so wonderful to see so many of you taking an active interest in our beautiful community. We have a lot of exciting things to discuss tonight." She droned on for 20 minutes, going through the standard agenda items, the landscaping budget, the pool maintenance schedule, a reminder about the new rules for recycling bins. The tension in the room was palpable. People were shifting in their seats, whispering to each other, tapping the folders on their laps. I stood at the back of the room, watching her, waiting for the right moment. Finally, she reached the end of her prepared remarks. And that concludes the board's presentation. We now open the floor to questions from the community. An older gentleman I didn't know stood up. "I have a question," he said, his voice firm. He held up the folder. "I'd like to know about Prestige Property Management." A murmur went through the crowd. Brenda's smile faltered for just a fraction of a second. "I'm sorry, what about them?" she asked, a slight edge to her voice. "I'd like to know why our community has paid this company over $80,000 in the last 2 years for inspection services that you appear to be conducting yourself," the man continued. Brenda's face began to flush. "Prestige provides essential back-office support and consulting," she said dismissively. "It's a standard operational expense for an HOA of our size." That was my cue. I stepped forward from the back of the room. All eyes turned to me. "Brenda," I said, my voice calm and steady, projecting to every corner of the room. "Can you please tell the community what your relationship is to Robert Peterson, the owner of Prestige Property Management?" Her eyes narrowed into slits. The mask of the friendly neighborhood president was gone, replaced by the cold fury I had seen on the night of the snowstorm. "That is an inappropriate and personal question," she snapped. "I think it's a very appropriate question," Mr. Allen chimed in from the front row, his voice booming with authority. "Since our money is going to his company. Is he, or is he not, your brother-in-law?" The room erupted in a chorus of angry questions. Brenda was cornered. "He is a relative, yes," she admitted, her voice trembling with rage. "But he was the most qualified vendor." "Qualified to do what?" Mrs. Gable's son shouted from the side. "To cash our checks." I held up a hand, and the room quieted slightly. I walked to the front and placed one of the highlighted bank statements on the table in front of her. "Let's talk about other expenses, Brenda. Can you explain this $400 charge at Nordstrom? Was that for the back-office support as well? Or how about the weekly fuel purchases when the HOA doesn't own a single vehicle? Were you filling up your own car with our money?" She stared at the statement, her face turning from red to a pasty white. She was speechless. Her 2 board members looked at the document, then at her, their faces a mixture of confusion and horror. They were beginning to realize they had been her unwitting accomplices. "This is an outrage. It's a smear campaign." Brenda finally stammered, standing up so quickly her chair scraped loudly against the floor. "The only outrage here, Brenda, is what you've done to this community," I said, my voice rising with controlled anger. I held up the letter she had sent to my mother. "This is the letter you sent to my dying mother. You threatened to take her home away from her over a fabricated fine, all while you were stealing from us. You used your position not to serve this community, but to enrich your family and to bully anyone who got in your way." I turned to face the crowd. She fined me for helping my neighbors during a blizzard. She harassed an elderly widow. She threatened a sick woman. And she stole tens of thousands of dollars from all of us. This is not a leader. This is a thief and a tyrant. The room exploded. People were on their feet, shouting, demanding her resignation. Her 2 board members were backing away from the table, trying to physically distance themselves from her. Brenda stood there, cornered and exposed, her face a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. She opened her mouth to scream, but no words came out. At that moment, the back doors of the clubhouse opened. 2 uniformed police officers stepped inside. Mr. Allen, the old negotiator, had apparently anticipated things might get heated and had discreetly made a call before the meeting started. He had simply requested their presence to keep the peace. But now, their presence meant something more. One of the officers approached the table. He said to Brenda, his voice calm but firm. "I think you need to come with us. There are some people here who would like to file a formal complaint." Brenda's authority, her power, her entire fabricated world, crumbled to dust in that instant. The reign of the petty dictator was over. The aftermath of that meeting was swift and decisive. Brenda was taken to the police station for questioning. Several homeowners, including myself and Mr. Allen, went down to give formal statements and hand over our copies of the evidence. The district attorney's office took one look at the case and pressed charges. It was a slam dunk: embezzlement, wire fraud, and conspiracy. Her two cronies on the board resigned in disgrace the very next day, claiming they had been duped and had no knowledge of her activities. Whether that was true or not, no one really cared. They were part of the regime, and the regime had fallen. The State Department that oversees homeowners associations stepped in, declared the board defunct, and scheduled an emergency election to form a new one. The legal process against Brenda moved forward with surprising speed. Faced with the mountain of irrefutable evidence, she had no choice but to take a plea deal. She pleaded guilty to felony embezzlement. The judge was not lenient. He spoke at length during the sentencing about the abuse of trust and the predatory nature of her actions, specifically mentioning the letter to my mother as an example of her extreme malice. She was sentenced to 2 years in state prison and ordered to pay full restitution to the Cedar Creek HOA, to the tune of nearly $100,000. Her oversized house, the symbol of her unearned superiority, was sold to cover the debt. The day the verdict was announced, a wave of palpable relief washed over the neighborhood. It felt like a fever had broken. The oppressive atmosphere of fear and suspicion that Brenda had cultivated for years vanished overnight. People started talking to each other again. Neighbors who had been afraid to make eye contact were now stopping to chat in the street. The community was healing. At the emergency election, the neighborhood voted in a new board, led by Mr. Allen. His first act as president was to call a special meeting. At that meeting, the board formally and unanimously voted to void every single fine Brenda had ever issued. They then held a vote to completely overhaul the bylaws. The convoluted, punitive rules she had created were thrown out. They were replaced with a simple, common-sense set of guidelines designed for one purpose only: to maintain property values and ensure the safety and quiet enjoyment of the community. The era of taupe harmony, trash cans and silent wind chimes was over. My own vindication was complete. The fraudulent fines against me were expunged from the record. The HOA's new legal counsel sent a formal letter of apology to me, and another to my mother, for the harassment and distress caused by the previous board. That letter, which I did show to her, brought a small, tired smile to her face. She passed away a few months later, but she did so in the peace and security of her own home, unburdened by the threats of a petty tyrant. I was hailed as a hero in the neighborhood, a title that made me deeply uncomfortable. People would stop me to shake my hand, to thank me for standing up to her. I appreciated the sentiment, but I didn't see myself as a hero. I was just a guy who had been pushed too far. I had defended my family, my business, and my community because I had been left with no other choice. When they asked me to join the new HOA board, I politely declined. I had no desire for power or position. I recommended a few other good, level-headed neighbors, and then I went back to what I did best, running my business. It's been a few years now since Brenda's reign of terror came to an end. Cedar Creek is a better place than it ever was. The community is more connected, more engaged. People look out for one another. The annual meetings are still well attended, not out of fear, but out of a shared sense of responsibility. We learned a valuable lesson about the danger of apathy and the importance of standing up to bullies, no matter how small their kingdom. I saw Brenda once, about a year after she was released from prison. It was in a discount grocery store in a town 20 miles away. She looked smaller, diminished. The arrogant, self-righteous fire in her eyes was gone, replaced by a dull, defeated emptiness. She was pushing a wobbly cart with a few generic brand items in it. Our eyes met for a brief second across a pyramid of canned beans. I saw a flicker of recognition, then shame. She quickly looked away, turning her cart down another aisle and disappearing. There was no apology, no acknowledgement. There was nothing left to say. I didn't feel anger or even satisfaction. I just felt a quiet sense of pity. She had thrown away her life, her reputation, and her freedom, all for the fleeting thrill of controlling her neighbors' lives. She had built a prison of rules for us, but in the end, the only one who ended up truly trapped was her. Sometimes, when I'm out on a cold winter morning, plowing snow from a driveway, I think about it all. I think about how a simple act of neighborly kindness can be twisted into a violation, and how quickly a community can fall under the sway of a petty tyrant. But then I see Mr. Allen waving from his window, or I see the new family that moved into Brenda's old house planting flowers in their yard, any color they want, and I'm reminded of the other lesson. That decency and reason, when pushed to the brink, can find an incredible strength. That one person, armed with the truth, can indeed fight City Hall, or at least the Homeowners Association. My life is much the same as it was before Brenda. I work hard. I pay my bills. I take care of my customers and my neighbors. The peace I fought so hard to reclaim is a quiet, everyday sort of peace. It's found in the hum of a lawnmower on a summer evening, the friendly wave from a passing car, and the silence of a neighborhood blanketed in fresh, untouched snow. It's a peace that is precious, and one that I will never again take for granted.